Anytime it's a first, it's usually the most memorable. Whether it's the firstborn, the first car, the first kiss. I think for quilters, the first quilt that they ever made is the one that they remember the most. I remember every detail about that first quilt that I ever made, from what fabrics I used, to the pattern, to the things that I struggled with. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one that remembers all of those details about their first quilt. Some people don't know this about me, but I stand 6 feet 6 inches tall. And for me to find clothes, well, especially pants and pants that fit me, yeah, it's not easy. Originally, I wanted to learn how to sew my own pants because I could never find pants that fit me right. It was always too big around the waistline, or the inseams were a little too short. So one day I kind of just figured, well, let me just make my own pants. I went searching for sewing classes, but they always seem to be during work hours, so I could never attend one. And then one day I got the idea that maybe, just maybe, someone has a sewing tutorial on YouTube. So I went hunting online for sewing tutorials on YouTube. What I found were videos by this very, shall we say, boisterous woman, and she worked for a company called Missouri Star Quilt Company. Now, at the time I didn't know any better, but I thought, well, quilting is a form of sewing. So if I learn how to quilt, I can then try and figure out learn how to sew my own pants later on down the line. So in my mind, quilting and sewing were pretty much the same thing. Well, yeah, that was a big assumption to make, and that was the wrong assumption to make. But I started following this Jenny Doan and discovered other quilters on YouTube, and I started learning how to quilt that way. And that was pretty much my introduction to the world of quilting. One of the first quilt blocks that I learned was or I should say maybe the first series of quilt blocks that I learned was the disappearing blocks. There's the disappearing 4 patch and the disappearing 9 patch. I saw a tutorial on how to make those blocks, and I thought it was, well, rather simple to do. So I wanted to give it a try and make a disappearing 9 patch quilt. But I was going to do it a little differently because something didn't make logical sense. I mean, why would you cut up a fabric into a million different pieces only to sew it back together, cut it up again, and only to sew it back together again? That to me at the time didn't make sense. And to some degree, it still doesn't make sense today. My arrogant and inexperienced self said, wouldn't it be faster to just cut the individual pieces first, then sew everything together so that I'm not repeatedly sewing and cutting and sewing and cutting multiple times? That's just how I was operating. Traditionally, the disappearing 9 patch block is constructed by first sewing together 3 equal size squares. You make a row, then you repeat it 2 more times to make 2 more rows for a total of 3 rows. Then you sew the rows together to make one giant square made up of 9 total squares, which is called the 9 patch. Then you cut it in half vertically and you cut it in half horizontally. Then rearrange the pieces and sew it back together. And to me, that was the part that just didn't make sense. I mean, the sewing and cutting apart, I mean, why wouldn't you just cut the individual parts the first time, sew it together once, and be done with it? Why do I have to keep cutting and sewing and cutting and sewing? I took all the fabric and figured out the measurements somehow and the amount of pieces or the amount of individual pieces that I need, plus the sizes, and I just went ahead and cut all the individual pieces all at once. Then I found out, oh my goodness, this was way more time consuming than what I had seen on the video. But I had already cut all the individual pieces, so at that point I was going back. I mean, I was at the point of no return at that point, so I just had to power my way through it and work through it. I kept thinking, gosh, I'm so stupid. Why didn't I just follow the instructions? Because they didn't make it seem like it was this much work to put together this quilt. But no, I had to do it my way, which I thought was way better. Yeah, well, you live and you learn. When you don't know any better, you think your way is faster. You kind of have to learn the hard way. That's exactly what I did. 2 months later, I finally got the quilt top done. And I thought, well, that's just it. I just have to sew a piece to the back and to cover the back or the inside of the quilt, and I'm done. Yay! Nope. Then I learned about the actual quilting part and, things like how to make your quilt sandwich and do the actual quilting itself. And I just remembered saying to myself, are you kidding me? By that point, I just wanted to just get the quilt done. I was so tired and I just wanted to just get this project done. So I tried to figure out what is the fastest way for me to do it. And silly me, I tried taking shortcuts when I didn't even know what the correct process was. One of the stupid things that I remember doing at the time was I was watching this video about how to quilt a quilt. And the first thing I heard was that I needed to switch sewing feet. Now, I thought sewing foot, when they said you switch sewing feet, I was thinking you have to switch which actual leg you sew with, or the foot that you use to press down on the pedal. I thought that's what they meant. So normally I use the pedal with my right foot. And when I heard it's now time to switch sewing feet, I said, okay, well then maybe I have to switch to my left foot. And I kind of thought, this is so stupid. Why can't I just use my right foot? But for some reason, I just thought that I had to use my left foot now. So I had my regular sewing foot and then I had my quilting foot. When you don't know what you don't know, you just make these stupid assumptions, and I can laugh about it now. But fortunately, I learned my lesson and decided maybe I should actually look into what this sewing foot really is. And then I heard about this thing called the walking foot. First question that came to mind was, how the heck are you supposed to walk and sew and quilt at the same time? Oh boy. But yes, eventually I did learn what all these terms were. And again, I can laugh about it now, but I just think, how stupid was I to think the way that I was thinking? Now, the actual quilting took about another month to do. All I was really doing was trying to stitch in the ditch, but for me, it was kind of stitching in and out and somewhere around the ditch. My sewing accuracy was pretty much all over the spectrum. It wasn't straight, it was kind of straight-ish. And my 1/4 inch was not really a 1/4 inch, but kind of more like a 1/4 inch-ish. In fact, let's just put it this way. Everything back then concerning my sewing and my quilting, it was something-ish. And don't even get me started with the binding. By that point, I was just saying, let's just get this done. It took me a while. Actually, I think about 3 months later, I finally finished the quilt. And I got it quilted and I got it bound. Well, if you can call it a binding. At certain points, the binding didn't actually bind. When I was done with the quilt, I thought, this is the ugliest thing in the world. I mean, from the fabric choices to the ugly stitching and the fall apart binding, it was something that I just knew wasn't put well together. You know, for some reason, even though it was the ugliest thing, it was something that I made. And I knew I couldn't give it away. Well, for one, again, it wasn't put well together, and even I knew that as a first-time quilter. But I wanted to keep it because it was the first. And I still have it in all of its fall-apart glory, and I still use it, and I'll probably keep using it until its last thread. The thing is that even though there are so many construction issues with it, to me, it's the most memorable of all quilts because it was the first one. And it also reminds me on how far I've come as a quilter. When I look at it now, I can laugh and say to myself, what the heck was I thinking? As frustrating and as time-consuming as it was for me to put together that quilt, I did find that I enjoyed the process. In general, I like the creation process, and when I finished that first quilt, the first question that came to mind was, well, what's next? And at that point, I knew that I was curious enough to learn more techniques and more about the quilting process, and learning about different materials and such. And I also wanted to learn how to construct different quilt blocks. You know, my interest was piqued, and by that time, I think that was the process of me getting hooked on quilting. You know, every few years I like to make another disappearing 9-patch quilt, and I'll probably continue making them every so often, but each time that I make one, I'm reminded of where I started, how far I've come in terms of my skill level, my fabric choices, the techniques that I've learned. So in a way, this disappearing 9-patch quilt, it's sort of become a benchmark in showing me where I started, where I am now, and possibly where I'm headed. For me, there's something satisfying about seeing that growth. And when you think about all the frustration you went through in learning these different techniques or trying to master a difficult pattern, those frustrations kind of become golden memories in the spectrum of your quilting journey. And these are things that you can kind of laugh about later. In 2017, I made the quilter's pilgrimage to Hamilton, Missouri, and I visited the shops of the Missouri Star Quilt Company. And it just so happened that Jenny Doan was walking around in one of the stores, and so I got to meet her for the very first time. And I shared with her my story about how I wanted to learn how to sew pants, but was diverted to this world of quilting partly because of her. Actually, I should say totally because of her. And she asked me, "Did you ever make those pants?" And I said, "Nope." I found the world of quilting and I never looked back. From time to time, I would see Jenny at various quilting events around the country. And every time I would run into her, she would always ask me, "So, did you ever make those pants yet?" And till this day, I have not. But I have made many quilts along the way, and I will probably keep making more quilts, so there's more to come. But like I said, I found quilting and I never looked back. And yeah, I'm still on that quilting journey.